she would remember the silence of that day above all else. It was a hollow, ringing quiet that came after the last stone of her life had been overturned, leaving her exposed beneath the vast, indifferent sky. They had called her the widow, a title that felt both too large and too small for the space she occupied in the world at 25. Her brothers, their faces hard with a righteousness she did not understand, had taken the house, the fields green with promised corn, the cattle lowing in the pasture. They left her the barn. A skeleton of weathered timber and dust, filled with the ghosts of harvests past and the scent of hay and forgotten things. But it was in that hollowed-out silence, clutching a letter written in her father's fading hand, that she would find the beginning of a new sound. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock she never knew existed, the groan of a hidden door, the whisper of cool, subterranean air. It was the sound of a lifeline, a secret buried deep in the earth, a legacy not of land or livestock, but of survival. This inheritance, deemed worthless by men who saw only the surface of things, would not only save her from the encroaching drought of poverty but would become the wellspring from which an entire valley, choked by the greed of one powerful man, would learn to drink again. The forgotten daughter, the quiet widow, would become the keeper of the water, the architect of a future her father had seen long before the dust began to rise. The reading of the will had been a brief, brutal affair, conducted in the stifling parlor of the main house. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the self-satisfied piety of her elder brother, Jacob. He stood by the mantelpiece, one hand resting upon it as if he were already the master of the estate, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. Nathan, the younger of the two, hovered near the window, his gaze fixed on the parched yard outside, his compliance a shadow that followed Jacob everywhere. Annalise sat alone on a small, horsehair sofa, her hands folded in the lap of her simple grey dress. Mr. Abernathy, the town solicitor, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by a rod of pliable wax, read from the document in a dry monotone. The farm, the livestock, the accounts in the town bank, all to be divided equally between his two sons, Jacob and Nathan. Annalise's name was mentioned last, a footnote in the grand story of her family's prosperity. To his daughter, the will stated, her father bequeathed the old barn and its contents, along with his deepest love and the prayer that she would find strength in unexpected places. Jacob's mouth twitched into a smirk, a fleeting expression of triumph he quickly masked with a somber nod. "It is as father wished," he declared, his voice booming in the small room. "A sentimental gift." "He always did love that old barn," Nathan mumbled his agreement, not daring to meet Annalise's eyes. She said nothing. She simply inclined her head, her stillness a stark contrast to their restless ambition. They saw a meek woman, a widow broken by grief, easily dismissed. They did not see the quiet fire banked deep within her, the observant nature that had missed nothing of their greed, their condescension, their utter underestimation of her. As she walked away from the house that was no longer hers, heading toward the derelict barn that was, she felt not despair, but a strange, burgeoning calm. They had taken everything they could see. She was left with the unseen, the forgotten, the underestimated. And in the quiet solitude of her disinheritance, she had a feeling that was where true value lay. She spent the first night in the barn's loft, a thick horse blanket her only comfort against the chill that seeped through the warped planks. The cavernous space below was a cathedral of shadows, moonlight striping the dusty floor through the gaps in the walls. For the first time since her husband Thomas had passed, and now her father, the grief felt clean, unburdened by the presence of her brother's judgment. Here, there was only the honest scent of old wood and earth, the rustle of a mouse in the hay, the vast and silent witness of the stars. In the morning, she found the letter. It was not with the will, but tucked inside an old leather-bound almanac her father used to read, left on a small workbench he had favored. His handwriting, a strong and steady cursive, was a comfort in itself. "My dearest Annalise," it began. "If you are reading this, then the world has taken a shape I feared it would. Your brothers are good men in their hearts, but their eyes see only the acreage of a field and the heft of a coin. They do not see the deeper currents. They do not understand that a storm is not the only thing a wise man prepares for. Sometimes, the most devastating threat is the absence of rain." He wrote of his love for her, of the strength he had always seen in her quiet watchfulness. "I have not left you destitute," he continued, the ink slightly darker here, as if he had pressed the pen with greater urgency. "I have left you a foundation. Your inheritance is not the rotting timber of the barn, but what lies beneath it. Go to the old forge, the one we have not used in 20 years. Count 5 paces toward the northern wall. There you will find a floorboard marked with a carpenter's cross, barely visible now. Pry it up. Trust what you find. It is a lifeline, not a treasure. Use it with the wisdom I know you possess." She read the letter 3 times, her fingers tracing the familiar loops of his signature. A lifeline. The word echoed in the silent barn. She looked over at the cold, rust-covered forge in the far corner, a relic of a time before the town had a proper blacksmith. It was covered in cobwebs and discarded tools. 5 paces toward the northern wall. A flicker of hope, fierce and bright, ignited in the desolate landscape of her heart. With a length of rusted iron she'd found near the forge, Annalise knelt on the dusty floor, the rough wood pressing into her knees. The light from the open barn doors was weak in this corner, and she had to run her hands over the grimy planks, feeling for any imperfection. Her fingers, raw and smudged with dirt, finally caught on a faint, shallow engraving. A cross. It was just as her father had written. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, hopeful rhythm. She wedged the iron bar into the thin crack beside the board and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. The wood was swollen, settled by decades of humidity and neglect. She repositioned her grip, putting her entire weight into the effort. With a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness, the board splintered and gave way. Beneath it was not earth, but darkness. A square of perfect, silent black. Reaching into the opening, her hand met not soil, but the cold, smooth contour of a cast iron ring. She hooked her fingers through it and pulled. A section of the floor, far larger than the single plank, groaned in protest, lifting to reveal a steep set of narrow stone steps descending into the earth. A wave of cool, musty air, smelling of damp soil and preservation, washed over her. It was the scent of a place untouched by time. Lighting an old lantern she found on the workbench, she held it over the opening. The flickering light illuminated a small, circular cellar, its walls lined with meticulously stacked shelves. Jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, sacks of flour and beans, barrels of salted meat. It was a larder fit to see a family through the harshest of winters or the longest of droughts. In the center of the room sat a single, heavy wooden chest, bound with iron straps. With trembling hands, Annalise approached it. The lid was not locked. She lifted it, the hinges sighing softly. The lantern light caught the dull, heavy gleam of gold. It was not a pirate's treasure of glittering jewels, but a practical fortune, stacks of coins, neatly wrapped and sorted, a solid weight of security that took her breath away. This was her father's foresight made manifest. A secret kept, a promise fulfilled. The lifeline. After the initial shock subsided, a profound sense of purpose settled over Annalise. This was not a windfall to be squandered or a means of escape. Her father's words, a lifeline, not a treasure, guided her thoughts. She knew she could not manage this alone, she needed counsel, people who had understood her father's heart. That afternoon, she walked the 2 miles to the small cottage where Samuel and Martha lived. Samuel had been her father's most trusted farmhand for 40 years, his hands as gnarled and wise as the roots of an old oak. Martha, his wife, had run the household with a quiet efficiency that was the farm's true engine. They greeted her with worried eyes, having heard the news of her disinheritance. She sat at their small kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands, and told them everything. She spoke of the letter, the hidden cross, the cellar, and the chest. Samuel listened without interruption, his gaze steady, while Martha occasionally patted her hand, her expression shifting from pity to astonishment. When Annalise finished, Samuel leaned back in his chair, stroking his grey beard. "Henry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He always saw the weather coming long before the clouds gathered. And not just the weather in the sky, he looked at Martha, a silent communication passing between them. "We knew he was preparing something," Martha added softly. Years ago, when that banker, Finch, first came to town with his smooth words and shiny shoes. Your father never trusted him. He said Finch was the kind of man who would sell you a dipper of water in a rainstorm and call it a bargain. Samuel nodded grimly. Henry saw how Finch was getting his hooks into people, offering loans that seemed generous until the first dry spell. He started working on that cellar at night, telling everyone he was shoring up the barn's foundation. He paid the masons from another county, in cash. Said he was building a root cellar for the ages. They explained how her father had foreseen a prolonged drought, studying almanacs and weather patterns, convinced the valley's prosperity was built on a fragile assumption of endless rain. He believed Finch would use the inevitable hardship to consolidate power, to bleed the farmers dry and seize their land. The cellar, the provisions, the gold, it was a fortress against a coming siege, a siege of economics, not of armies. Alastair Finch operated from the town's only brick building, the emblem of the Finch Trust and Savings Bank carved into the stone above the door. He was a pillar of the community, a deacon at the church, a man whose public demeanor was a carefully constructed facade of gentle authority and civic concern. He greeted his customers by name, inquired after their children, and offered condolences for their losses. Privately, he was a vulture, circling the valley, waiting for the weak to stumble. The drought her father had predicted had arrived with a vengeance. The sun beat down from a mercilessly white sky, cracking the earth in the fields and shrinking the creek to a muddy trickle. Finch began to move. He was patient, methodical. The first notices went to the smallest homesteads, farmers on marginal land whose debts were minor but whose resources were non-existent. He would express his deepest regrets in his office, his hand steepled, his expression one of profound sympathy. The terms of the loan are quite clear, he would say, his voice a silken apology. I have investors to answer to, you understand. My hands are tied one by one. Deeds were signed over, families packing their meager belongings onto wagons and heading west, their faces etched with a despair that Finch found quietly satisfying. His true prize, however, was the sprawling acreage that had belonged to Annalise's father. He knew Jacob and Nathan. He had assessed their arrogance and their lack of their father's prudence. He had extended them a generous line of credit to purchase new equipment shortly after Henry's passing, knowing full well it was a trap. Now, as their crops withered in the fields and their cattle grew thin, he watched them, waited, and polished the foreclosure documents that sat in the top drawer of his mahogany desk. He had underestimated Henry once, finding the man's quiet distrust of him insulting. He would not make the same mistake twice. He would dismantle the man's legacy, piece by piece, starting with his own sons. The worthless barn left to the mousy daughter was an amusing afterthought, a footnote he barely considered. Annalise, armed with the knowledge from Samuel and Martha, began to see the intricate web Finch was weaving across the valley. She saw the desperation in the faces of her neighbors at the general store, heard the hushed, fearful conversations about dwindling water and overdue notes. Her father's plan had been for survival, and she now understood that it was not just for her own. It was for the community he had loved. With Samuel's guidance, she devised a plan. He knew the families who were most vulnerable but also most resilient, the ones who would fight for their land if given half a chance. He also knew of a discreet freight agent in a town 50 miles east, a man who owed Samuel a significant favor. Annalise wrapped a small number of gold coins in a canvas pouch. It felt impossibly heavy in her hands, a tangible weight of responsibility. Samuel took the pouch and, under the cover of a moonless night, rode out of the valley. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived for the county water commissioner. It contained an anonymous payment, made in full, for the collective water rights of 5 small farms bordering the creek, securing their access for the remainder of the year. It was a move Finch had not anticipated. He had been counting on those rights defaulting, allowing him to seize them and effectively choke the farms into submission. When the commissioner informed him that the accounts for the Miller, Jensen, and 3 other properties were settled, a flicker of cold fury disturbed Finch's placid exterior. It was an anomaly, an unexpected move on a chessboard he believed he controlled completely. He made quiet inquiries, but the payment was untraceable, a bank draft from another territory with no name attached. It was a small act of defiance, a minor disruption to his grand design, but it unnerved him. For the first time, He sensed another player in the game, a ghost moving in the periphery, and the tidy, predictable world he was constructing suddenly felt a little less secure. The lifeline had been cast, a quiet ripple spreading outward from beneath the floor of an old, forgotten barn. The sun continued its relentless assault on the valley. The fields that Jacob and Nathan had inherited with such pride were now expanses of cracked, grey earth and brittle, yellowed stalks. The creek that watered their herds had slowed to a brown, sluggish crawl, and the price of feed had tripled. Their arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sour sweat of fear. They had spent the last of their father's bank savings and the credit from Finch was long gone. Finally, swallowing what was left of their pride, they put on their Sunday coats and went to see Alastair Finch. They were ushered into his cool, dark office, a sanctuary from the oppressive heat. Finch let them stand for a long moment before gesturing them toward the two hardback chairs facing his desk. He listened to Jacob's stammering request for an extension, for another loan, just enough to see them through to the winter rains. Nathan said nothing, his gaze fixed on a crack in the plaster on the wall. When Jacob finished, Finch leaned forward, the mask of pleasantry gone, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice dangerously soft. "Your father was a prudent man. A cautious man. He never spent a dollar he didn't have. You, on the other hand, have demonstrated a remarkable talent for fiscal fantasy." He produced their file from his drawer, tapping a manicured finger on the ledger. "You are overextended, your collateral is worthless, and your land is dying. To loan you more money would not be a bad investment. It would be an act of charity, and I am a banker, not a philanthropist." Jacob's face turned a mottled red. "This is our father's land. You can't just—" Finch cut him off with a raised hand. "On the contrary. According to these documents, which you both signed, it is my land. Or it will be in 30 days when your note comes due. I suggest you use that time to make arrangements." The dismissal was absolute. They stumbled out of the bank and into the blinding sunlight, stripped of their pride, their inheritance, their future. The weight of their folly was crushing, and for the first time, they understood the true nature of the man to whom they had entrusted their legacy. They had been left with nothing. Nothing but a sister in a dilapidated barn. Humiliation was a bitter meal. For 2 days, Jacob and Nathan barely spoke, the silence in the grand farmhouse thick with blame and despair. They saw the foreclosure notices Finch had posted on the fences of their neighbors. They saw their own future in the grim, defeated faces of the families loading their wagons. On the 3rd day, it was Nathan who finally broke. "We have to talk to her," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Jacob, who was staring out at the ruined fields, turned on him. "And say what? That we were fools? That we lost everything father built while she lives in a pile of rotting wood? She has nothing, Nathan." "She is all we have left," Nathan insisted, a quiet strength in his voice that Jacob had never heard before. "We owe her an apology." If nothing else defeated, they made the long walk across the cracked pasture to the barn. They found Annalise inside, mending a horse blanket, the space around her tidy and organized. She looked up as they entered, her expression calm, unreadable. Jacob could not bring himself to speak, so Nathan stepped forward. "Annalise," he began, his voice cracking. "We were wrong. We were arrogant and we were greedy. Finch is taking the farm. We've lost it all." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "We came to say, we are sorry." Annalise set aside her sewing and stood, her gaze moving from Nathan's pleading face to Jacob's averted one. She saw not the domineering men who had dispossessed her, but 2 broken boys, lost and afraid. In that moment, her quiet strength solidified into leadership. "Father did not leave me with nothing," she said, her voice clear and steady in the vast, quiet space. "He left me with a foundation." She led them to the corner, to the loose floorboard and the hidden ring. She lit the lantern and guided them down the stone steps into the cool, silent earth. She showed them the shelves of food, the barrels of water, and then she lifted the lid of the heavy chest. The sight of the gold silenced them completely. They stared, uncomprehending. "He knew this was coming," Annalise explained. "The drought. The man Finch's. He knew you would not see it. This was not meant for me alone. It was meant for all of us. It is a lifeline, and it is time we used it. The barn became the heart of the valley's resistance. It was no longer a place of exile, but a command center, a sanctuary of hope. With Jacob's practical knowledge of farming and Nathan's head for numbers, tempered now by humility, they worked alongside Annalise, Samuel, and Martha. The plan that unfolded was not one of escape, but of entrenchment. Annalise directed them to use a portion of the gold not to pay Finch, which would only delay the inevitable, but to invest in the future. Following a plan detailed in another of her father's letters found at the bottom of the chest, Nathan rode out and purchased a new, steam-powered drilling rig from a catalogue, having it delivered to a rail station 2 towns over. Under the cover of night, with the help of the few families whose water rights Annalise had saved, they hauled the rig to a central location on what was still, for a few more days, Jacob and Nathan's land. They began to drill. It was a gamble, a desperate act of faith in their father's meticulous geological surveys, which he had also left behind. For days, the steam engine chugged, a sound of noisy hope that drew curious, then anxious, glances from Finch's office. The banker assumed it was a futile gesture, the last gasp of a failing enterprise. Then, they hit water. A deep, cold, and plentiful aquifer, immune to the surface drought. It was not a gusher, but a steady, reliable source that could sustain the entire community. They had their own water, independent of the creek Finch now controlled. The lifeline was no longer just gold, it was the earth itself yielding its secrets. With their remaining funds, they purchased drought-resistant seed from Mexico, a type of hardy corn her father had researched, and established a community seed bank. The gold became a cooperative fund, allowing families to buy what they needed not with credit from Finch, but with support from their neighbors, to be paid back in shared labor or future crops. The barn, once a symbol of Annalise's meager inheritance, was now filled with sacks of seed, plans for irrigation, and the quiet, determined murmur of a community refusing to die. Alastair Finch watched from his window as a water wagon from the new well delivered barrels to the Miller farm, and he fell to cold dread. He had not been defeated by an army or a rival banker. He had been outmaneuvered by a quiet widow in a worthless barn.